Next slide. So this section of the presentation, I'm going to talk about the federal grants that we've been awarded. We spent some time at the last council meeting talking about the Coronavirus Relief Fund in particular, which is awarded as part of the CARES Act. But in addition to that, there's other federal funding that we've received as well, which is going to be beneficial in not only helping us from the response perspective of dealing with this health crisis, but also helping some operational challenges as well, in particular with our mass transit and our international airport. So I'm going to go through some of those, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about the HEROES Act, which you all took an action on yesterday in regards to that letter of support for that piece of legislation, which is currently being reviewed and discussed. IT, can you go to the next slide? So this is a summary of the 6 different federal agencies of which we've received federal funding from, totaling over $182.5 million that we've received. So the largest, of course, which we've talked about pretty extensively, that $119 million from the U.S. Department of Treasury, but not to be overshadowed by the FTA, that almost $41 million that's going to go towards our Sun Metro. Also additional money from the FAA for the international airport, money from the Housing and Urban Development, also from the Health and Human Services, and then also even the Department of Justice. Next slide. So on the FTA side, there was a total of $25 billion that was included in the CARES Act. Sun Metro's piece of that was just under $41 million, so $40.8 million. One of the good things about that is that there's no city match. It's a 100% federal share. And these funds are going to be able to be used to support not only the operating, but also capital and other expenses which are eligible under their current programs. Next slide. One of the big things with this, and I've mentioned this during some of the updates that I've done over the last several weeks, is that not only can it be used for expenses to maintain their transit services, but it can also be used for administrative leave for employees that have been impacted due to reductions in service levels. And so I wanted to spend a little bit of time here because there's been questions about using the coronavirus relief funds to help employees that have been furloughed or terminated those contract positions. However, those coronavirus relief funds, remember, have completely different guidance. And so the FTA, again, each agency is different, the way that these funds have been allocated. These funds in particular, the guidance that's been provided for the use of these funds states that it can be used for those employees that have been impacted as a result of the reduced operations. And so next slide, please. So Sun Metro's plan is that they're going to utilize these funds for not only the current fiscal year to offset the impact that they're seeing. I showed you some of the ridership numbers that we're seeing as far as decreases yesterday during the presentation and that budget update. So those funds are going to be used to offset the impact from this year, and then also will help with the expected budget challenge for next year as well. So some of the grants, as it mentions there, going to be used for some capital items, some additional bus shelters, also some shop equipment, and then also some related supplies and materials. Next slide. On the Federal Aviation Administration funding that we received, in the CARES Act, there was $10 billion allocated to eligible U.S. airports, again, to respond to the coronavirus impacts. The El Paso International Airport's piece of that was $15.4 million, and again, similar to the FTA, 100% federal share, which means no city match. So it was really, really good to see not only the allocation of these funds, but then also not having to put up a city match was very, very beneficial. Next slide. Again, the expenditure for these funds, of course, needs to follow the FAA revenue use policy. One of the stipulations tied to this funding is that the airport must continue to employ 90% of the employees that they had as of March 27th, and they must maintain that 90% through the end of the calendar year. And so similar to the FTA, it's, there's different requirements, different guidance for each of these pots of money, and this is one that was included in the FAA allocation of funds. Next slide. So the international airport is going to be using these funds similar to the Sun Metro for not only this current fiscal year, but also for next year as well. They're going to be able to use these funds to help pay some of their debt service for this current year, some additional security, custodial and parking lot expenses, some of the firefighting and police employees that they have that are assigned to the airport, and then some of the things that have happened which may not necessarily be reimbursable, but the temporary abatements and some deferrals as well that have taken place. Next slide. During the coronavirus relief funds, we did talk about that $119 million, and in addition to that, we talked about the additional funding received for the CDBG and the ESG, the Emergency Solutions Grant. So the Housing and Urban Development, the City of El Paso's allocation, just under $5.8 million. Nicole Farini outlined how those funds are planned to be used, and she'll cover that here in her section coming up again, but additional funds again to go towards rental assistance, utility assistance that we can use for those important programs for our community. Next slide. Again, that $5.8 million, you see the list here. Nicole Farini went into detail on those different areas. Her section will be following mine, and she'll go into more detail in regards to these particular programs and the outreach that have been done with all of the stakeholders involved. Next slide. For the Department of Health and Human Services, the City of El Paso received $1.6 million. Again, this is funding that, again, is primarily intended to respond to the COVID crisis. The eligible expenses are going to go towards staffing, equipment, and supplies, and the Public Health Department has already spent these funds, and they've used it for PPE, some surveillance lab testing, and some other preparedness and mitigation efforts. Next slide. The Police Department received approximately $600,000 from the Department of Justice, and they're going to utilize this for personal protective equipment and for some administrative and overtime hours. So all of these different pots of money really helped go towards the response efforts. I mean, you saw a very thorough presentation from Dr. Carranza outlining all of the different challenges and issues we're facing, not only from the health crisis that we're addressing, but also the financial challenges now that we're going to continue to experience for an extended period of time. So all of this additional funding, this $183 million, although there's limitations and restrictions on how these funds can be used, the funds are going to be very beneficial in helping us address this long-term recovery. So whether it's the additional testing, contact tracing, education, prevention, compliance that Chief D'Agostino talked about, all of the community programs for the recovery that we have in place that are going to be discussed here pretty thoroughly, and then on the economic development side to help our small businesses get back up and running. So all of these different pots of money are critical in getting us back to where we need to be to continue to build and recover from what we're facing. Next slide. We've also received some miscellaneous grants as well. So a couple $100,000 total for National Endowment of the Humanities. Again, these are for our museum departments. $50,000 from the National Endowment of the Arts, and then $1,200 from the Texas Commission on Arts. Next slide. One of the things we talked about in the last update was the use of FEMA funding. So in the CARES Act, there's $45 billion total allocated. One of the things that is typically required when you're using FEMA funds is that there's a 25% city match. So we've currently spent about $3.6 million, and those costs continue to increase as we're charging more and more to the coronavirus response. But as of last week, we have spent about $3.6 million total. We haven't submitted a response yet to FEMA because of that city match. So if we're looking at close to $4 million, 25% of that, we're looking at $1 million that we would need to eat essentially in those additional costs. And so what we had done is we had built in all of these costs into the coronavirus relief fund response, that $119 million. But it hasn't been official yet, but we did receive word early last week that the White House is potentially going to ease that 25% match. Although we have not seen that guidance come out in publication yet, we'll continue to monitor for that release of that. If that's the case, then we'd be able to charge that to FEMA, that $3.6 million to FEMA, and then that would free up some of the funds within the coronavirus relief fund, that $119 million. Next slide. Again, we spent a lot of time at the last meeting talking about the $119 million, the requirements, the restrictions that we have on the use of these funds, that the recommendations are really centered around the long-term response and recovery, so increasing testing, the contact tracing efforts, the education, prevention, and the compliance efforts, and then the community and economic development response and recovery efforts. Next slide. So this was the breakout, just over 84 million for the public health and safety response, 16.4 million for the community response, and then 18.4 million for the economic response. And just to point out again, that 16.4 million for the community response does not include the additional 5.7 that I just referenced from the housing and urban development funding we received. So when you take those two combined, it's over 21 million total for the community response and recovery programs. Next slide. So there was a little bit of discussion yesterday about the HEROES Act. These are just some of the very, very high level points from that legislation that was passed in the House on May the 15th. One of the important items in there is the $375 billion for local governments, which really help offset the revenue impacts that we're facing. Also included in there $75 billion for testing and contact tracing. Again, additional funding, which would really help towards the response of this health crisis. There's really not been any formal dialogue yet at the Senate level. We expect now that the holiday just passed, the discussions will start to heat up. We'll see what continues to come about from this. We'll continue to monitor as we have with all of the other federal funding that's available to us and that we've taken advantage of, not at the federal level, but the state level as well. Next slide. And so with that, I want to turn it over to Nicole Farini, who's going to talk about the community vulnerabilities and the human services.